Welcome to tonight's session, proudly brought to you by the Zionist Council of New South Wales. To all of you in New South Wales, thank you for spending your last night of lockdown with us. May you all enjoy your freedom from tomorrow. Tonight's session will focus on countering BDS and the role of law in achieving this. The session will cover the current hot topic, no pun intended, Ben and Jerry's decision to cease business in the West Bank from next year, other BDS flashpoints, the effects of BDS is having on Jewish communities in the US and the UK, and we'll also hear a bit about IRA. After the formal presentation, we will have time for questions and answers. Please use the chat facility to post your questions. Tonight, we are extremely fortunate to have as our presenters two well-known Australian lawyers, Arsen Ostrovsky and Ryvchin, who are both passionate advocates for defending the state of Israel, fighting anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Both are experts in their fields, regularly sought out by news agencies throughout the world for comments, opinions, and have published countless articles in all facets of media. They were both born in the Ukraine and raised in Sydney. Arsen now lives in Israel with his wife and daughters. Alex resides in Sydney with his wife and daughters. In addition to being the Zionist Council of New South Wales Israel Director, Arsen is a leading international human rights lawyer. He has spoken before the UN Human Rights Council, in parliaments across Europe, to audiences in North America, as well as regularly addressing the Knesset and other high-level forums. In 2018, Arsen was awarded the Nefesh B'Nefesh Bonei Zion Prize in Israel Advocacy. Most recently, Arsen was recognized by JNS as one of the top 40 advocates for Israel. Currently, Arsen is the CEO of International Legal Forum, which is a not-for-profit organization fighting to promote justice, peace, and equality in Israel and the Middle East. Alex is the co-chief executive officer of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry and the author of two internationally acclaimed books of history and politics. The Anti-Israel Agenda, Inside the Political War on the Jewish State, and Zionism, A Concise History. Alex has served as a spokesman for the Zionist Federation UK and was awarded a prestigious Israel Research Fellowship to work as a research fellow and staff writer at a Jerusalem-based think tank. And when Alex needs a diversion, he authors an international bestseller, A New Day, written during coronavirus pandemic to help families overcome adversity. I now hand over to Arsen to commence the discussion focusing on BDS and related matters. Arsen.
All right, thank you, Rodney, for that introduction. First and foremost, it would be remiss of me not to note that my parents are in on this Zoom, and that today's my mother's birthday, so I have to wish her a happy birthday live here as well. Before we get into the tachlis of the BDS discussion. But thank you, honestly, Rodney and the Zionist Council for the tremendous work you're doing. And above all, it's also not only an honor, but really a pleasure to be on this with my dear comrade and friend, Alex, with whom I probably go back longer than I think just about anyone else that I can think of. We both, as Rodney noted, came to Australia at the same time, and honestly, I couldn't think of any more better leader to serve the Jewish community in Australia at the moment than Alex. But I think above all, we're also proud girl dads to daughters between us. So I think that's the toughest task. If you think fighting BDS was tough, we have a whole other mission on our hands, indeed. So it's always a pleasure to be with you, my friend. In the course of actually thinking about, reflecting on what to say and sort of how to open it, it occurred to me, and I mentioned this before, it occurred to me that Alex and I wrote an op-ed together some 10 years ago in 2012 about BDS. So I think it was our first formal collaboration. And the article I have printed here, if you can see by the heading, BDS Final Showdown Sounds Too Much Like a Final Solution. That was 10 years ago, 2012. At the time, that was in response to one of the BDS leaders who actually said that and I'm quoting, BDS is not another step on the way to the final showdown. BDS is the final showdown. Now that sounds, of course, jarringly similar to none other than the final solution, because it is, and that is ultimately the same goal. Whereas one sought to bring about the end of the Jewish people, the BDS movement is very clear. You have to look at just what the leaders themselves say, like Omar Barghouti, like others who say we don't believe in a two-state solution, we want a one-state solution. So whereas one sought the end of the Jewish people, this BDS movement ultimately seeks as its goal the destruction of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. So in a lot of ways, you know, we often, when we hear about BDS, we'll hear this, you know, these lofty humanitarian labels of justice and peace and human rights, all these sort of virtuous values. And often, as we heard with Ben and Jerry's, and we'll touch about that, of course, later. But, you know, I think it's important to underscore that ultimately that is a charade. That is a facade. We shouldn't be fooled by these lofty terms, because they have no such interest in peace, no such interest in justice. They don't even care about the Palestinian people, because ultimately it's the Palestinians themselves that suffer and hurt the most out of any BDS movement, because they're the ones that will lose jobs, lose income, lose the ability to look after their families. So it's not about promoting Palestinian rights, it's ultimately about denying Jewish people, and by extension the Jewish state, our rights. The question we have to ask, you know, is ultimately how successful has the BDS movement really been? When, you know, the ultimate goal is the destruction, they do look at vilifying, delegitimizing, and demonizing the Jewish state. So how successful have they been? What have they done? What have they achieved? Have they brought peace? Have they brought two sides together? No, they haven't. On the contrary, they're pushing the parties apart further. And you only have to look at Israel at the moment. Right now, speaking to you from Tel Aviv. Today, Israel is strong. Israel is resilient. Every major tech company has a presence here. Microsoft just last week announced that they're doubling their investment in Israel, which I supposedly would think that now every single boycott supporter would, you know, if they're going to be true to their words, would essentially stop using their PCs, stop using their computers, whoever might be on Zoom right now. The economy here is strong. The tourism is thriving, at least it was pre-COVID, and hopefully with the economy opening up and even more tourists from Australia, but the economy and the tourists from all around the world are thriving, are coming in. And ultimately, you have to look no further than the Abraham Accords and the growing acceptance of Israel in the Arab world, UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, even Sudan. As we're speaking right now, Israel for the very first time is openly and publicly displaying a pavilion at the Expo in Dubai, in the Gulf, an Arab country. Of all the expos, of all the pavilions, of all the 190 plus exhibitions there, it is the Israeli one that is garnering the most attention. So in so many ways, perhaps the Abraham Accords have been the most breathtaking display of failure by the BDS movement. So it could be forgiven for asking in a lot of ways, why are we even having this discussion? You know, why are we even talking about this? But there is a number of reasons why I think it is important, and why I think these discussions are crucial, and a lot of the issues that certainly Alex and I will delve into are important. One, it's because, and I'm sure I speak for all of us here, is that ultimately we all support, we all yearn, we all want to see peace. The BDS is the very antithesis of peace. Instead of working to bring Israelis and Palestinians together, it seeks to pull us apart. Instead of creating bridges, it's seeking to create wedges and barriers. And instead of creating an environment that is conducive to peace and facilitating the conditions necessary for peace, it is creating more hatred, more enmity, more distrust, and more violence. And I think that last point about violence is exceptionally important, because when we're looking around the world today, looking around Europe, looking around the United States, we're seeing this growing level of anti-Semitism and violence directed against Jews. That is not happening in a vacuum. It's not happening out of nowhere. Australia certainly is not immune with anti-Semitism occurring as well throughout the country, including, of course, Sydney and New South Wales. This does not happen in a vacuum. It doesn't happen out of thin air, out of nowhere. It is a direct result, I think, of this pervasive discourse on Israel that we're seeing that's being pushed by the BDS movement, by their supporters, and importantly, by their enablers, including with such labels as apartheid, with a denial of rights to both the Jewish people and the Jewish state, the demonization of an entire group of people based purely for no other reason than our race, our nationality, and our faith. And because it ultimately does legitimizes, emboldens, and encourages the violence and an excuse and justification of what we're seeing on the streets today. So don't let anyone fool you that BDS is a purely non-violent movement. It is not. It does have direct links to terror groups, and that's something that has been confirmed and elaborated on, and we've seen connections to groups like PFLP and others. And it does promote, enable, and drive violence today. So that's one of the reasons why it's so important that we speak out and that we act out, because ultimately it is also not us here in Israel, for example, that bear the brunt of it, even though we are the target. It is ultimately, I think, the Jewish communities in the diaspora that really face the brunt of it. In Israel, we have an Iron Dome, but we need an Iron Dome to protect, or an anti-BDS dome, I should say, to protect also diaspora Jewish communities against attacks and against being on the front line of these campaigns. Today, I think it's important to also recognize that we're seeing the BDS supporters and activists are becoming much more, I don't want to say intelligent or smarter in their means, but much more deceitful. So whereas they're not necessarily referring to their campaigns as boycotts or BDS because they understand the negative consequences, ramifications of that, but we're seeing them change their language and terminology. We're seeing their campaigns couched in the language of human rights. We're seeing them talking about corporate social responsibility and ethical investments, which are all ultimately euphemisms for boycotts and BDS. So we need to be careful and mindful of that, and mindful of sort of the language that is being used, the language that's being appropriated as well for their campaigns. But the good news is, and there is good news. Good news is that we have a means and a way to respond. We have legal tools at our disposal. It's something obviously we're going to talk about in greater length. When we look around the world at the moment, we have in the United States, we have laws against BDS. In Europe, banks are cancelling accounts. In Israel, there is a law against BDS as well. We're looking at the role that Ira and Alex will talk about that as well, plays in this. So I know we'll be discussing all of these. We'll talk about Ben and Jerry's, which has really caught a lot of the attention, and how that's sort of very much a flashpoint and a case study in terms of how we respond to BDS going forward. So I know there's a lot of things to discuss, a lot of steps to discuss. I know Alex has a lot to say on it as well, and we're looking forward to having this discussion with all of you.
All right, thank you, Arsen. Well, first of all, I want to thank the Zionist Council for hosting me and for the wonderful work they do in education, activism, and youth engagement in New South Wales. And I particularly want to note the contributions of Rodney, of Orly, Rebecca, Orna, Tennille, and immediate past President Richard Balkan. And I want to say what a great pleasure it is to share the stage with Arsen. As you've heard, Arsen and I have known each other since we were boys, but we lost contact somewhere there in the middle as we each made our way in the world. And I was a lawyer practicing in London and contemplating giving up the security and the rewards of a top-tier law firm to pursue what I considered my calling of advocating for our people. And I came across an article Arsen had written for The Australian. Actually, my brother had sent it to me. And it was a typically spirited defense of Israel. And seeing someone who I knew so well and who shared my family background as a refugee from the Soviet Union, who had also practiced law and who, like me, had no family wealth to fall back on, seeing him throw the stability and comfort of the Lord of the Wind to serve the community, it helped me make up my mind to devote myself fully to this righteous and necessary fight. And when Arsen and I briefly overlapped in our time living in Israel about a decade ago now, I remember Arsen constantly badgering me to join Twitter, convincing me that this was the new battleground. And it took a while, but he finally won me over. But Arsen had correctly identified back then that the world of advocacy and influence was changing, that it was beginning to shift away from episodes of Q&A and writing letters to the editor and moving to the rapid and global world of online advocacy. So Arsen deserves immense credit for that vision and for building up a huge following and becoming a real leader in that field. Before we talk about the fight back against BDS and the role of the law in that fight, we need to be clear about what BDS actually is and how it operates. I think as lawyers, we tend to look at it in a very formulaic, technical way. We look at the three aims of BDS as stated by its founders, being the right of return into Israel for 7 million descendants of Palestinians who left their homes for various reasons in 1948, full equality for Israeli Arabs who already have full equality, and complete withdrawal by Israel from Arab lands, whatever that means. And then we consider the implications of adopting those three aims, and we conclude that it means the end of a majority Jewish state, and therefore the end of Jewish self-determination and autonomous existence. We then note that BDS seeks no such measures or outcomes for any other state, and we put it all together and we conclude that BDS is anti-Semitic and should therefore be dealt with the full force of the law. I don't particularly disagree with any of that, but BDS, we need to understand, is not about implementing the three aims. It's not even about inflicting economic damage on Israel through boycott, divestment, and sanctions, even though these are economic measures. BDS is about turning public opinion in the Western world against Israel by creating a popular movement, a platform from which to convince the world through the power of repetition that Israel is inherently and irredeemably evil, has no place in this world, its daily existence is a stain on humanity, and it needs to be destroyed by any means, peaceful or violent. The people who framed the BDS movement and lead it hold the same views as those who opposed the partition plan in 1947 because it meant the creation of a Jewish state. They are the people who locked our families in a Europe poised to obliterate them by pressing for the British White Paper in 1939. They are the successors to Haji Amin al-Husseini, who sent 1,500 Jewish children from Bialystok to Auschwitz because he didn't want them ending up in Palestine, and who told the Peel Commission he opposed a single Jew remaining in Palestine. The idea to found this movement that we call BDS, whether it be in 2001 or 2005, depending on who you ask, to base it on the anti-apartheid movement was not about renouncing violence. It was a purely tactical decision. After the failed wars of 1967 and 73, those committed to Israel's destruction realized Israel could not be defeated by military force. So they embarked on a new path with the identical aim. As Arafat's security chief Abu Iyad said, if one could succeed in changing public opinion in the Western world, then the overthrow of Zionism would be just a matter of time. So BDS is a key tactic used to bring about that change in public opinion. When they go from campus to campus in the US, holding debates on divestment, it doesn't matter whether they win the actual vote or not. Even if they win, they know that divestment won't have any impact on Israel's powerful and diverse economy. But merely by holding the vote and the hearings and the campus events that precede them, they have successfully put Israel on trial and seared into people's minds stories of Israeli bloodlust, cruelty, and illegitimacy, just as they did at Marrickville Council, as they do in the conferences of labor parties around the world, in trade unions, human rights organizations, and the UN. So even when they lose the vote, they still win because public exposure is the key to their success. BDS must be understood as just one tactic deployed by the anti-Israel movement. When BDS was defeated at Marrickville Council in Australia in 2011, anti-Israel activists publicly conceded that Australia had no interest in BDS and moved instead to campaigns about mistreatment of children, allegations of apartheid, and moves to recognize a Palestinian state. Each of these approaches, just like BDS, creates constant opportunities to debate Israel and defame it and anyone who dares speak up for it. The question arising from all this is, what is the best way to fight such a campaign? One that thrives on publicity, good or bad, and that appeals predominantly to idealistic young activists who want to be part of a resistance movement, something that looks revolutionary and counter-establishment. If we look at the biggest blows to BDS in the past decade, they've not been through the passage or use of legislation. The greatest blow to BDS, as Arsen identified, has been the Abraham Accords, which has made those parliaments like Ireland that are criminalizing settlement produce, or the EU and its settlement labeling guidelines in the UN with its blacklists, look utterly ridiculous when traditional foes of Israel are lining up to embrace it. The biggest setback we in Australia inflicted on BDS was at Marrickville. And we did it not in the courts, but in the public domain by building a broad anti-BDS coalition, isolating BDS activists and exposing their hypocrisy and extremism. The law is indeed a critical battleground in our struggle, as we saw in the International Court of Justice advisory opinion in 2004, and current threats by the Palestinians to attempt to smear Israel through the International Criminal Court. But the use of the law in fighting BDS and the anti-Israel movement broadly should be calibrated carefully to each jurisdiction, and what works in the US won't necessarily work in Australia. In an Australian context, the law should be used when a Jewish student has to sit in a lecture while the professor shows the image of the Israeli flag superimposed with the swastika, or when an academic waves banknotes in the face of an elderly Jewish woman during a scuffle caused by BDS activists. The law should be used when people freely fly the flags of anti-Semitic terror organizations like Hezbollah on our streets, the flag of a group which bombed a Jewish center in Buenos Aires and plots attacks on Jews and Israelis around the world. The law should be used to reform the complaints procedure at the ABC, our national broadcaster, publicly funded, which produced horrendous reporting during the last war and did so with no accountability to the taxpayers that fund them. So one of the key tools in fighting anti-Semitism is the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. And I'll talk a bit about this and then we'll open up to a discussion. So a bit of background, IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, it was founded in 1998 and it has 34 full members, including Australia since 2019. And the Alliance implements the Stockholm Declaration, which commits the members to oppose anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial, to commemorate the Holocaust and commit to education and so forth. And in order to combat anti-Semitism, IRA had first to define it. And also for the purpose of analyzing trends and data, they had to come up with a definition. And that definition was drafted by scholars and adopted by IRA in 2016 as part of a commitment to build an international consensus around the definition, while stressing that it should not be legally binding. And it's been adopted by countries such as the UK, US, Canada, Germany, Greece, Switzerland, by the European Parliament, by universities like Oxford and Cambridge, by sporting clubs like Chelsea FC, and then the entire Football Association. It's not a controversial definition, it's non-partisan, and it's the latest in a series of definitions that preceded it. The EU had its own working definition on similar terms, the US State Department also. And the greatest service of IRA is that it shows both the traditional and contemporary examples of anti-Semitism in society, and particularly how they do and don't occur in the context of Israel and the Israel discourse. So for example, it explicitly states that to criticize Israel in a way similar to other countries cannot be considered anti-Semitic. But to deny the right of the Jewish people to self-determination, to compare Jews to Nazis, is not a form of policy criticism, it is anti-Semitism. Now, IRA came to greatest international prominence during the time of Jeremy Corbyn, his inglorious time leading British Labour. And he very begrudgingly finally adopted it on behalf of the party in September 2018, after a massive furor and scandal with anti-Semitism, both by the leader and members of the party, and how it was handled. And what was particularly scandalous about that episode and the entire furor and debate that emerged around it is that it challenged the right of the Jewish people who have lived anti-Semitism for millennia to define what anti-Semitism is. And it alleged that we were doing so, we were advancing this definition, which was non-controversial, not because we want to protect ourselves from the scourge, but for some nefarious, cunning political purpose to shield Israel from criticism. And that sort of allegation would not have been made against any other people. Now, the ECAJ is currently embarking on a campaign to seek bipartisan support in the federal parliament for the adoption of the IRA definition. We held a public meeting with Anthony Albanese, the leader of the Labour Party, a couple of months ago, in which he pledged, if elected, to formally adopt IRA. And we saw just today at the New South Wales Labour Conference a motion supporting Albo's endorsement of IRA and also renouncing BDS. So that's the state of play with IRA.
It's interesting. It's something, I think it's important to really underscore with respect to IRA, and certainly a thing that you touched on, Alex, is that it does have very broad bipartisan support. It does have that in Australia. It has that in the United States as well, both under the previous Trump US administration and now under the Biden administration, which has said, and I quote, that we enthusiastically support the endorsement of the IHRA definition, IHRA definition. So that's something I think it's especially critical. It does have that very broad consensus. And actually one of the latest countries to have adopted the IHRA definition or provided support is Bahrain. Which is, in the Gulf, it's an Arab, it's a Muslim country, and they've openly endorsed it and all its elements, all its features and characteristics, including the anti-Zionist element. So when we're having Arab nations now endorsing this definition, which is something unheard of barely a year ago, it's something that's earth-shattering, I think, in so many ways now. The only other thing I would add, and I think it's important, is there's a lot of misconceptions around IHRA, and I think one of the main ones is that it in some way stifles free speech. It doesn't do anything of the sort. It doesn't stifle free speech. It doesn't constrain any criticism of Israel that is legitimate criticism, and certainly doesn't deny Palestinians any rights or equal treatment. And as Alex said, that very specifically the IHRA definition, working definition, provides for the fact that legitimate criticism of Israel that is directed against any other country is specifically not anti-Semitic. What is anti-Semitic and we have to then ask those people that are criticizing it, what do they want admitted?
Exactly.
Making Nazi analogies, that's not anti-Semitic. Denying Jewish people the right to self-determination, that's not anti-Semitic. Using, distorting the Holocaust or demonizing an entire group of people, are these the features they really want to permit in, whether through the back door or other means? So the IHRA definition is very clear that legitimate criticism leveled against Israel, that's leveled against any other country, that's fair. But it's when you cross those red lines, that's when it becomes an issue.
It's a classical straw man argument. I mean, those who have been intent on trashing the definition, and in doing so, taking away the right of the Jewish people to define what hatred against us looks like, I think we've got a pretty good experience of it. They've often said over and over again, we've heard this by far left activists in the UK Labour and around the world, as you said, that it has a chilling effect on free speech, that it criminalizes standing up for Palestinian rights. It does absolutely nothing of the sort. And in my discussions with federal politicians in this country, there has been very little, even amongst those on the left, once you actually explain to them and run through what the definition looks like, what it seeks to define as anti-Semitism, and something that cannot be considered anti-Semitic, there is very little pushback on it. And I've posed that question to them exactly as you said, Arsen. For those who oppose the definition, what is it that they want to say about Israel that they feel they won't be able to say, that they feel constricted in? And really, it only would prohibit the most egregious, offensive accusations against the state of Israel and the Jewish people, effectively the transference of classical anti-Semitic motifs from the Jew to the Jewish state.
It's also important, even though we're talking about legal tools, that the IHRA definition never was intended to be, nor is it a legally binding definition. Its sole purpose is to act and to serve as a guide, as to help, whether it's legislators, educators, police, enforcement, judicial authorities, to identify what is and what isn't anti-Semitism, and then to use within the existing legal means of whichever jurisdiction, whether in Australia through the anti-discrimination laws or through other countries, then to ultimately use that as a means to take further possible steps, whatever they may be within the existing law. But the sole purpose of this, you can still say what you want to say, but the sole purpose of the IHRA working definition, it's important to also underscore, it is a working definition, is the fact that its sole ultimate purpose is to act as a guide, to provide and to serve as an indicator to the instances which may be anti-Semitic.
And the nature of anti-Semitism, as you and I well know, Arsen, is that it evolves over time. And, at times it has attacked the Jews as a faith for our religious beliefs. other times the Jews as a nation, as a people, as an ethnic group, as a race, and at times the Jewish state. And even amongst people of good faith and good intention, there is overwhelming ignorance about what anti-Semitism is. Everyone can recognize the swastika and Nazism and expressions of that as anti-Semitic. But beyond that, there's very little understanding of what it is. And that's where ARA is a very important tool in helping university administrators, local councils, corporations treat incidents, handle them, and understand exactly what they are and what their nature is. And we see it at Australian campuses a lot. I mean, I spoke about how after Marrickville, BDS effectively went away as a tactic. There was a pivot from the anti-Israel movement away from BDS towards other forms of demonization. And we see the sorts of resolutions that come through university councils and guilds, which completely deny the right of the Jewish people to a state, which are so extreme, provocatively extreme in their language. And amongst administrators and other students, they look at this and think, well, this is just harsh criticism of Israel, not understanding where criticism ends and hatred begins.
I'm curious, we're talking about, there's different tools, certainly, and I think it's important to bear in mind, that what works in Australia, I think, as you said, Alex, might not, or what works possibly in the US and in Europe might not necessarily work in Australia. Certainly it's a very different climate, it's a very different legal framework, and certainly the situation with respect to BDS is very different. Australia is not Europe, it's not campuses in the US, so it's not on the same volatile level. That said, there's we want to make sure, of course, also that it doesn't get to that level as well. So I'm curious, whether some of the tools, and I know you might think, Alex, you said perhaps some of the tools that we're looking at in the overseas might not necessarily work possibly in Australia. But when you're looking at, for example, in the United States, and that sort of ties into Ben and Jerry's perhaps, in the United States, they have something like, I think 35 states now, it's more than half, that have passed anti-BDS laws, and which are very clear, and in essence say that if you in any way support, advocate, aid or abet the BDS, you cannot have business with our state. And I'll give you some examples. Across Europe, as one example, a number of banks are increasingly shutting down or cancelling accounts of groups that support BDS. Why are they doing this? They're not doing this because they're all of a sudden found their inner Zionist. They're doing this because they know they want to work and operate in New York and Illinois and Texas and Florida, New Jersey and South Carolina and so on. When you're looking at an example like Ben and Jerry's, which I think is very, relevant to the times, people ask, why is Ben and Jerry's such a big deal? And there's a couple of reasons. One is that in a lot of ways, Ben and Jerry's is a test case. What Ben and Jerry's have done, we've heard a lot of reports that Ben and Jerry's is simply opposed to operations in the West Bank, in the settlements. However, we know now that not to be the case, because the board of Ben and Jerry's themselves, including the chairperson of the board, who has very openly advocated for BDS and apartheid claims, has very openly said their goal is not to operate in Israel at all. Green line, whichever way, whichever side of the green line. So Ben and Jerry's, we're talking about a proper full boycott of Israel, not just the West Bank, not just the settlements. So that is, in many ways, I think, reflection and perhaps a possible trend of BDS activists trying to couch their boycott of Israel in settlements and sort of putting these quasi sort of ultimatums saying, if you don't stop operating in the settlements, then we won't have any operations with Israel altogether. Within Israel itself, that becomes a problem because under Israeli law, you may be liable for breach of discrimination if you choose to discriminate on people based on their certain location. In other words, whether someone lives in Tel Aviv, Haifa, or Ma'ale Adumim, you cannot discriminate against them. But it also has an effect now on Ben and Jerry's and their parent company, Unilever, and their operations in the United States. Now, Unilever had bought Ben and Jerry's some number of years ago, I think 10 years ago, maybe give or take, maybe a little bit less, for about $320 million. But now you have this fact that some dozen states across the United States have said that they've launched investigations into Ben & Jerry's and Unilever for possible breaches of the anti-BDS laws. And what does that mean? That means that if they're found to be in violation of these laws, it means that Unilever and Ben & Jerry's cannot apply for state contracts with those states. But what it means even more, and this is where you're sort of really getting to possible levers for change, it means that these states will have to also divest from public pension funds that invest money in Unilever, which is where the real money comes into it. So far, we've had, I think, 4 states that have actually confirmed they'll be withdrawing their money from Unilever because of they're being found in violation of the anti-BDS laws. And you're talking about already, by 4 states alone, something like $700 million already that's being withdrawn from them because of violations of these state laws. And this is just 4 states. You're going to have more states to come as well. You also have possible breaches of federal anti-discrimination laws in the United States. You also have possible breaches of the law in the United Kingdom. And you see also by this, you see this interconnectedness. And when you're talking about, for example, Australia, whether there is virtue in having similar laws possibly in Australia or not, that's one discussion. But if you have a company in Australia that's in any way seen as endorsing or adopting or supporting, facilitating, aiding or abetting a boycott campaign, that means that under United States law, they may be penalized in the United States. They may be prevented from operating in certain states, and they may find that their investments in pension funds, whatever that invest in these companies, may be withdrawn as well. So that's certainly something that needs to be looked at in a broader light. And talking about Ben & Jerry's, there's certainly different angles that are being looked at. Certainly possible legal claims for breaches of law here in Israel. In the US, we've seen the different states investigating both on the state and federal level, and I believe that with time we'll also find a number of individual claims starting to arise as well of possible litigation action against the companies, because ultimately, everyone I think is watching this, and I think certainly from Israel's perspective, there needs to be a very strong sign that they're not willing to stand by as a company that talks about, virtues and social justice is, as we're seeing, again, the very antithesis of that. Instead of talking about this, they're actually discriminating against and demonizing one group of people and one country, and that's Israel and the Jewish people, by applying a double standard and by applying special opprobrium and discriminatory practices which they do not apply, for example, in China, where they have a very profitable practice, or other parts of the world. So that's sort of something we need to bear in mind, and how companies in Australia that may be in breach of this can also become affected by these laws overseas.
Yeah, firstly, to your point about partial BDS or boycotts of settlements, I mean, this is something certainly that BDS activists in the US have been attempting to push for a long time. There was this publication they put out probably about 10 years ago called Divest Now, which is a handbook for how to run BDS campaigns on American university campuses. And it explicitly said that first push for boycotts of settlement produce, because it's easier to make the case, and then go for full BDS. So the way the anti-Israel movement works, BDS activists in the movement more broadly, is they're based on incremental gains and momentum. And one step which can seem in some way reasonable or can be sold as being compatible with human rights or international law is never the extent of what they're seeking. The end goal is always unequivocally the destruction of the Jewish state. That's what they're after. And all the steps along the way slowly get them towards that point. That's why it's so critical that we fight them early on, that we fight every step of the way. In terms of BDS legislation for Australia, it's been something that has been put to me a number of times, why don't we push for this? My personal view is that it wouldn't be effective or successful in Australia for many reasons. And I think the main reason is, as I've discussed, BDS is merely one tactic of the anti-Israel movement. And as a tactic, it's effectively dead in Australia, and we killed it at Marrickville. Now, that's not to say that we won't have more BDS issues arising in the future, But I think Marrickville remains the case study, the gold standard of how to effectively fight BDS. The way BDS was defeated at Marrickville was by forming a broad coalition, including Labor people, Labor left people, even some Greens people, isolating BDS activists, rallying the media, briefing them extremely well on a regular basis, feeding them stories, making them aware of the hypocrisy, the stupidity, the extremism of BDS activists. And when you put questions to BDS activists about, will you now boycott China, as was put to the mayor of Marrickville at that time, they inevitably say something stupid, which gets them into more trouble and angers more and more people. And so to me, that remains the way that you fight BDS, through the court of public opinion rather than through legislation. And I think that if in Australia, if we push for legislation, it would necessarily lead to a public airing of this issue. It would lead to debate, TV segments, and exchange of op-eds, that whole thing over a protracted period of time. And while we are convinced of our truth, we know we're in the right and we fear nobody in a public exchange, the skill of BDS activists is that they are on discipline and on point with their repetition about Israeli apartheid, about genocide, ethnic cleansing. It doesn't matter how absurd those allegations are, how detached from the truth they are. And when you repeat something often enough, it seeps into the public consciousness. So I think we have very little to gain from a public debate about the merits of legislation and much to lose. And you also look at, in the United States, you quite rightly point out, Arsen, it's been widely adopted by dozens of US states, but there's always been some dissent, and from sometimes in cases from areas that you wouldn't expect it, from within the Republican Party, the Libertarian wing that opposes boycotts in principle, but defends the right to boycott as a free speech issue. And some Democrats who have gone along with anti-BDS legislation have kind of privately said that they're not really comfortable with it. And arguably, despite the passage of those laws, we've seen the rise of a more activist anti-Israel wing in the Democratic Party. So, I admire the merits, not so much the merits, but, the motivation of those who seek this legislation, but whether it's effective in the long term, I'm not sold on.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think you make a valid point there. Australia's in a very different climate. It's in a very different situation than the United States, than other parts of the world. And even though we're talking about legal tools here, specifically, ultimately the battle against BDS needs to be waged against all these multiple battlefronts, as you say, in the media, through education, online as well. But I think ultimately, we need to, and I think something that you do especially well in Australia is also to build alliances with other faith groups, other groups in civil society as well, that ultimately do care about issues that the BDS is against. And, we want to, the BDS wants to create barriers, as I said, it wants to create walls, it wants to separate us. So the very, you look at the Abraham Accords, which is one of the best responses to the BDS, and you look at the local communities, look at projects, look at joint projects that work to build peace, that work to bring people together, not separate them. I think that ultimately will be the strongest response to BDS, but always at the back of the mind, we do have the law on our side as well when needed and when the circumstances are relevant.
Thank you. I'm going to jump in here because we've you guys could just keep talking. I mean, it's just wonderful.
Days and days and days. It's a good thing you jumped in.
Really could. And there's so many questions, but I think, the main one that I'm going to start with is very general, and just what you mentioned about having an anti-BDS dome. What can we do? Someone on the chat, Lucy's asked, what can we do on campus? But more generally, what can we do to build this anti-BDS dome? I'll let you guys have a chat about that. Thanks.
From my perspective, very simply, I'd say education is key. We need to, specifically on campus, I think, I know that the campuses are in many ways today the primary battlefield in terms of BDS wars, and a lot of the philosophical discussion is happening there, and certainly a lot of the physical effects that we see from whether Israel apartheid weeks and the like. And, even now, although Australia might be in lockdown, for example, some of the BDS activists perhaps are not having their physical events, but doesn't mean that they've gone away either. A lot of them are now confining themselves to the online world where, these attacks and campaigns spread like rapid fire. So I think education is certainly key. I know the Jewish community in Australia through the Zionist Council, through Orges, and of course through ECAJ as well, do a terrific job. So I think in as much as we can provide the students support, provide information, provide the tools in terms of the issues, in terms of talking about things like, Apartheid Week, BDS campaigns, what's happening on the ground. So I think in order to provide them, the education tools to deal with it, and also how to communicate and how to actually respond to them. I think those are the two main things from my end that I would suggest.
I certainly agree with that. I think the first thing I'd say about defeating BDS totally or protecting ourselves from it in a complete way, it's not possible. It's not possible through any level of education or any level of public campaigns or anything, any cleverly worded PR campaign to totally obliterate BDS, because like every expression of hatred for our people, there will always be those who adhere to it and continue it. What we can do, what we need to strive to do, what our aim should be, is to confine it always to the dark peripheries of society, to ensure that it has no mainstream or broad support. And I think, again, in Australia, we've done a fair job of that, a very good job of that. And I believe the way also needs to be done is through this process of inoculation. BDS, as Arsen and I have discussed at length, it trades in disinformation, in libeling Israel and people like us who dare support the Jewish state and Jewish self-determination. With everything, with every conception of evil. We're child murderers, we're war criminals, we're Nazis, whatever. And if we can insert as much information to the public domain about the truth of Israel, the truth of the Jewish people, in a way it inoculates the public from those slanders when they arise, particularly in times of war and conflict. So on the one hand, I think we need to be realistic about what our goal is. It's not total victory, because that's an impossibility. Just like the defeat of anti-Semitism is an impossibility. But through public activism, the sort of work that Arsen does extremely well online, we can contradict over time the sorts of slanders and lies that they insert into the public domain. I think it can be done.
Orally, I would add just one more thing to that. We need to be mindful that, and I think this is critical, that we cannot afford to always be defensive and always be reflective and always be responding to these attacks. We need to be able to respond in rapid time, in real time as well. But I think it's important that we also be proactive and that we seek to broaden the conversation on Israel. That doesn't mean by any means to shy away from the difficult issues or the challenging issues, but that we need to broaden the conversation. And we're talking about, say, pro-Israel advocacy, when we're asking students to be, say, pro-Israel or pro-Israel in Australia, because we obviously supported to the alliance very much. What does that mean? What are they standing up for? What is their vision of Israel? What is the vision of the alliance between Israel and Australia? So I think it's important to be a lot more proactive and to be out there, providing a narrative of what it means to them, what they stand for, without necessarily confining that to what it does not mean. So I think, and we've done for a long time, we've allowed ourselves to be defined by what our detractors seek to, labels they seek to apply to us, instead of what we want to put out there. So I think that's also important for students to know.
And I think also, as much as we need to speak the truth of what Israel is, which is a liberal democracy, which is an extremely humane and diverse society, I think we need to shine a light on the truth of what Palestinian society is as well. And the BDS movement for a long time, and the anti-Israel movement broadly, has traded in this language of a single state, a one state, which will be a secular democratic state. And they've managed to really bamboozle the world, the gullible amongst them, that they do have this vision of human rights in a secular society. And when you look at, for example, basic polling data conducted by Pew of the Palestinian territories, there is upwards of 90% support for Sharia law to be the law of the land. When you look at Hamas's recruitment and use of child soldiers, you could go on and on, talking about their violence, their corruption, their ineptitude. Everything they seek is incompatible with a liberal democratic state, secular democratic state. So as much as we need to speak the truth of what Israel and the Jewish people are and what our values are and what we do and what we believe in, we need to also expose the other side a little bit as well.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I'm just going to squeeze in one last question because there was a few about the divisiveness on IRA, and Susan Rutland, who's a member of the IRA delegation, is asking if you can comment on the Jerusalem Declaration and also on the fact that Dr. Tim Anderson won his case at the federal court. And then I'll also combine it with Debbie's comment about universities rejecting IRA. So just something general about divisiveness about IRA.
Well, Dr. Rutland is the authority, so I'm humbled to receive a question from her. I think she's in a great position to answer the question, but I'll do what I can. Firstly, for the Jerusalem Declaration, or basically what that is, it's a rival definition of anti-Semitism advanced by a group of left-leaning academics. And when you look at it on its merits, firstly, there's great overlap between IRA and the Jerusalem definition. A lot of what the Jerusalem definition says is perfectly sound. But what that definition seeks to do, it explicitly talks about BDS as not being anti-Semitic. And that's where really it strays. I think it reveals its motives and biases of the drafters. IRA is silent on that point. It doesn't talk about specific accusations and slurs like apartheid or genocide being anti-Semitic or not. It doesn't say boycotts are inherently anti-Semitic or they're not. But Jerusalem effectively seeks to absolve BDS activists from the charge of anti-Semitism, which they don't frankly deserve. As for the Tim Anderson case, I mean, that case is ongoing. The decision of the federal court, as I understand it, is that the issue of academic freedom is not some ethereal concept, but a contractual right. So the court will now need to look at whether academic freedom would protect Tim Anderson in that case. Whether academic freedom is so malleable and broad a concept that someone can hold up an image of the Israeli flag and a swastika, effectively that they can disgrace the university, malign their Jewish students, intimidate them in that way and face no consequences. My understanding of academic freedom is that it would never allow that. To me, this is a contractual dispute, and I think Sydney University is right in pursuing the course of action it has pursued, because Tim Anderson is a disgrace to the profession and to the university. What was the third element? Sorry, Orly.
It was about universities in North America rejecting IRA, and Professor Jan Grabowski posting about the rejection of it at his university in Ottawa. You may not have heard of that. I mean, it's...
Well,
yeah.
I know of Jan Grabowski very well. He's an eminent Holocaust historian and a great man and a great dissident and a great fighter. In terms of universities rejecting it, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, Oxford and Cambridge have accepted it. Other universities in the UK have, others debate it, likewise in the United States and Canada as well. Ultimately, this comes down to a process of making the case, of showing administrators and senates and student unions why this should be accepted. And I think the more acceptance it receives from countries, from organizations, multinational organizations like the EU, sporting associations, the more that it's seen in practice as being something helpful, a tool to help understand anti-Semitism, and not as something, you know, onerous or strategic in any way, I think more campuses will fall in line and accept it.
Thank you so much. And I think, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think it's, you know, it's important to underscore that at the end of the day, IRA is by far and away the most widely supported and endorsed definition of anti-Semitism. Agreeing, you know, not everyone has supported, but at the end of the day, it is the most widely supported definition. Some 35 plus countries have adopted or endorsed it, including the EU, including Bahrain, including South Korea recently as well, and others around the world. Hundreds of civil society organizations, sporting codes, civil institutions and campuses across the United States have also supported and endorsed it from across the political spectrum. There was an open letter by some 700 plus academics that we at the ILF were involved with earlier this year, which again, from different perspectives on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but all which came together to show their support and endorsement of the IRA definition. So yes, there are other alternate competing definitions, but I think those are on the fringe. And when we look closer to them, including the Jerusalem Declaration, you find certainly, I think, other ulterior motives which try and maybe try and absorb the BDS campaigns and movements through the back door. But at the end of the day, the IRA definition is the gold star definition that's been adopted and endorsed by the world over.
Great, thank you both so much. I'm unfortunately out of time and I have to give you both a very quick vote of thanks. So on behalf of the board of the Zionist Council of New South Wales, we would like to dearly thank you both, Alex Ryvchin and Arsen Ostrovsky, for all your contributions tonight and for shedding light on this very, very interesting and complex matter. Yes, we just really thank you all for everything and fighting the fight and keeping us all informed. And I'm going to hand over to Rodney Nornberger now, our president, to just close the meeting. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Orly, and I fully endorse her words. Alex and Arsen, your session was extremely informative, and thank you all for joining us here tonight. It seems a little bit like Seder because everyone's just, about to enter their freedom tomorrow. I wish everyone in New South Wales enjoy your freedom. All the best, and we hope to bring you more sessions of this caliber in the near
Rodney,
future.
I assure you there is light at the end of the tunnel. As someone who's gone through not one, not two, not three, but 4 lockdowns, there is light. There is light.
I managed to dodge it. It's great. And, all the best to everybody. Erev Tov, and I hope to see you again on a session in the near future. Thank you very much for joining us. Good night.
Bye, Rodney. Thank you.